Well, let's go ahead and get started. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we begin in full force. First of all, you can double click on the slide deck that you're seeing on this screen to kind of maximize that slide view so it's not in a smaller window. And I'm just going to do a quick sound check. So if in the chat window, you could just type in whether the audio is okay. That'll let me know if you can actually hear what's going on. And Lori, if you could just give me a shout out and let me know if we're getting some positive responses.
Great. So far, audio okay, good for me. So I think we're good.
Good deal. And as you've already discovered with the chat window is if you could just use that to ask any questions or respond to any prompts that we give, that will be helpful. And as always, keep yourself muted just to minimize the background noise. That would be helpful. And Lori, I'm gonna shoot it back over to you for the land acknowledgement, please.
Great, thank you. So I'm joining you today from Olympia, the traditional homelands of the Coast Salish people. The Coast Salish people have lived in what is present-day Western Washington and southwestern British Columbia for more than 10,000 years. I live a mile and a half from a city park on the shores of Puget Sound. Interestingly enough, named Priest Point Park, named for a priest who displaced the native people and their sacred gathering space to build a mission. But the land upon which Priest Point Park sits has been used for generations by the indigenous peoples of our region, which include the Squaxin, Nisqually, Quinault, Puyallup, Chehalis, Squamish, and Cowlitz tribes. We thank them for the use of the land upon which our parks and our homes are established.
Thanks very much, Lori. All right. Well, before we dive into the tool itself, I'd like to give you just a little bit of background on the development process and the purpose. The purpose of this screening tool is actually twofold. First, it is to provide a model screening tool to help districts comply with Washington state civil rights law that requires everybody to have a policy for reviewing instructional materials for bias. But secondly, it's really to provide educators, schools, and districts with some guiding questions on how to recognize bias in the instructional materials that can really impact student learning and their sense of belonging and empowerment. So just taking a quick walk down memory lane here. A version of this document was first released back in 2009 as the very unwieldy title of the Washington Models for Evaluating Bias Content in Instructional Materials. Over the last couple of years, we have heard from a lot of districts who have asked for that 2009 document to be updated to really reflect our deeper understandings as we think about what instructional materials should look like for the students in our rich and diverse Washington schools. And so here we are. The document that you're going to be looking at today is, as Lori mentioned, really the result of cross-agency collaboration, including our Learning and Teaching Department, our Equity and Civil Rights Office, the Office of Native Education, our Migrant and Bilingual Office, and our Center for Improvement of Student Learning, as well as input from external partners like educational service districts, school districts, and other collaborating organizations. So though the screening tool is geared towards the review of core instructional material that your district may be considering for adoption, the criteria that are posed should really also help guide the selection of supplemental and intervention resources. What is super important to remember is that this work should really be embedded in larger district and community efforts that are focusing on anti-racism, equity, culturally responsive teaching practices, and inclusion. So on this slide here, I have provided you with a few different places where you're going to be able to find this screening tool. And these links are all on that resource guide that we gave you earlier. So you should be able to find all of these when you go back and click on those, including the slide deck, by the way. So first of all, this resource is part of OSPI's Instructional Materials Toolkit, and that toolkit outlines suggested steps and highlights promising practices in instructional materials adoption. Most importantly, it provides resources like this one, and that's linked if you want to see all of the other great stuff that's in there. This resource can also be found on OSPI's Equity and Civil Rights page, that page that deals with reviewing materials for bias. And lastly, you can find different formats of the resource. You can find a PDF version, a doc version, a fillable form version on our Washington OER hub. So you'll be able to go back and download this material from any of those different sources. So when are you going to want to use this tool? As you all know, an evaluation of content for bias is a required portion of your district's larger instructional materials selection and adoption process. What you see on the left on this slide is actually one of the resources in our instructional materials toolkit. This particular one is designed to help districts involved in selecting and adopting instructional materials. In particular, this one is referencing a math adoption, but the steps should be the same for any content area. The screening tool really comes into play during several parts of this process. The most obvious one is, of course, the review and selection of core instructional materials. Here is where reviewers need to examine both the alignment to learning standards and target district priorities, as well as screening for biased content. But I want to point out that just as importantly, for successful implementation of this tool, district teams are really going to need to explore the screening tool itself and understand the criteria during step 3, which is really preparing for the review. The need is incredibly great for reviewers to understand what biased content looks like. So professional learning of your district review team is critical, not only to how to identify different types of bias, but also to spot material that has cultural relevance and diverse representation. As with your academic content review prep, time that you spend here having rich conversations and providing your review team with extended learning opportunities, it's critical, and it will definitely pay off in spades. So let's take a closer look at the specific strategy for screening for biased content. So let's assume that you've already assembled your review team. The first thing you're going to want to do is choose which parts of the instructional materials to analyze. Look, we all know that core instructional material can be thousands of pages. So review teams are going to want to select a few grades, a few units and lessons to really focus on. And if possible, you're going to want to select at least one lower and one upper grade. And be sure to take a look at some instructor-facing materials like teacher guides, as well as just the student-facing content. The next step requires engaging the review team in that really important professional learning I talked about just a second ago. On the tool itself, we've listed a couple of options that you might want to consider as you're going through professional learning with your team. These are absolutely not the only opportunities out there. We just wanted to provide a few suggestions that you might want to consider. So before you actually dive into the screening tool itself, prepare your team. Have everybody read the screening tool criteria, the examples, the scoring directions. Be sure to talk about any statement or term that requires some additional clarity or deeper understanding. We've actually included a glossary at the back of the resource that we'll be looking at here in a bit that hopefully will help provide some of that clarity. For each of the different criteria, reviewers are going to decide if it either meets, partially meets, or doesn't meet that criteria. Or maybe that particular criterion is not even applicable. Keep in mind, there are always going to be exceptions to these criteria. You might be looking at instructional materials that are intentionally focused on a specific culture, or maybe there are sections of the review criteria that just aren't relevant to your course. So as a team, you're going to want to discuss ahead of time when it's going to be appropriate to choose not applicable on the evaluation tool. If you're looking at, I don't know, a woodworking core instructional material, then maybe the section on family structures isn't going to be super appropriate, because that was never intended to be there in the first place. So before you start, you want to make sure your review team is calibrated. You want to make sure that they understand the scoring system and that they practice on a sample document to make sure everyone is on the same page in terms of how they're going to review the material. Once all that preparation is under your belt, the reviewers can actually start evaluating the material, marking the criteria as met, partially met, or not met. And this is important. Remembering to provide a rationale for each response. It's based on evidence from the instructional materials. The last step is going to be interpreting the results. I want to make it very clear. This screening tool is not intended as okay, we're going to calculate the score, and if it meets 45, it's good, and if it's under 12, it's not, kind of a situation. Instead, this is really intended to spark conversations among your team. Areas that are marked as does not meet or partially meets are a launch point for your team to have further discussion. Some things to consider might be to find out if the criteria scored similarly among team members. If not, what accounts for the differences you're scoring? Use evidence from the instructional materials to inform that discussion, and that's why it's so critical that your review team actually, notes that evidence when they're performing the review or the screening. And you want to be certain to flag any new considerations or concerns that arose out of the evaluation process. So after that kind of really quick walkthrough of the process, I'm going to turn you over to a colleague to talk a little bit about some of the criteria areas. And I do want to give you a heads up that for these next two sections, two of our collaborating partners on this document wanted to be here, well, not in person, but virtually at the same time with us. They were not able to. So you're going to be hearing a recorded portion for just a little bit when they're speaking to some of these different criteria. So I just want to give you that heads up. First is Arlene Crum, our mathematics director.
Okay, so
wow. Arlene had very little to say. Let's give this a shot. I'm going to go back and I'm going to try starting it again, and we'll see if it happened. And if not, then
okay. So thanks, Barbara. I'm going to take a look at some of the resource criteria. That is the different ways that you're going to take a look at your instructional materials to assure that they are free of bias. So it's important to make sure that there's representation in your instructional material that reflects the rich cultural diversity and lived experiences of all of your students. This wheel shows some aspects of diversity to consider as you review the criteria in the screening tool. You're also going to want to think about special populations or identifiers of students within your community. For example, you may have a largely military community, or consider students that you have experiencing homeless, or other particular groups that are highly represented within your population. You want to look for a variety of roles and character traits. That is, you'll need to look for stereotypes. Sometimes they can be overt. For example, depicting a male Latino teenager as a gang member. Other stereotypes may not be quite so obvious. Look for variations that could demean or exclude characters because of their race or gender or sexual orientation. Note on this section the grid format for scoring. You'll see that on the screening tool, and for more clarification on the criteria, you can always select the criteria guidance section, which you see linked in the highlighted section above the chart here. As you evaluate your materials, look for multiple perspectives and contributions from diverse peoples throughout the materials, not just a few pictures. In particular, when you are reviewing and adopting instructional materials for social studies and history, integrate the since time immemorial and tribally developed curriculum resources as are identified in our RCWs. Recommendations for reviewed instructional material may have been brought forward through the tribal consultation process. Significant representation of diverse historical figures and cultural groups is infused throughout the materials. Tokenism can be very prevalent in state and national history textbooks, which tend to mention indigenous people very sporadically and only in relation to European or Euro-American exploits. Now to ERA.
Okay, let's see if I can try the same trick again. I'm going to go back and I'm going to go forward again. Let's see if we get it.
As we go on to multicultural representation, we want us to think about what our classrooms look like today across the state. They are filled with a mix of different cultures, languages, traditions, and experiences. And we want to make sure that our instructional materials represent our students, but also represent communities that maybe are not represented in our own community, but give us a window into that experience without it being a stereotypical experience. So examples to look for: are there diverse ethnicities and nationalities are portrayed? For example, not all Asian families are Chinese, not all Latinx families are Mexican. Those are the pieces that we're also thinking about. We also ask that when you think about belief systems that are covered in instructional materials are presented in respectful and accurately with appropriate context. And if a belief system is covered, how is it presented, and that no one belief system is positioned as superior to others. With that bearing in mind, as the ELA director, we know that there is some text that is historical that may have this, and this is an opportunity for your students to read, especially if they're older, and to have those conversations about author's intent, purpose, and what does it mean when a story does do this, or when an article or a piece of informational text does have this portrayal, and why was it done, and what can we learn from it. So as Barbara said earlier, we don't want to exclude things, but we want to be really, really thoughtful if we are including certain contexts so that everybody understands how it is, how it was seen and how it can be used. Going on to that, we also want us to think about imagery and language. We really want to think about who is being represented. And as we know, historical and primary documents, including letters, newspapers, articles, treaties, journals, photographs, census reports, cartoons, and government documents, reflect the social and political and historical context in which they were created, including the biases and prejudice. These documents can be used effectively into classroom to examine the prevalence of certain biases at a particular eras in history, and to investigate how such views have influenced public policies, institutions, and people's lives. Understanding the development and impact of historical prejudices and other biases is a critical part of acquiring a more accurate and comprehensive picture of our history and our present circumstances.
So thanks, Barbara. I'm going to take a look at some of the resource criteria, that is the different ways that you're going to take a look at your...
Okay. Oh my goodness. Okay. Give me a second. I'm not sure why that they both started speaking at once, but we're Lori, while I am futzing around finding the next slide, if you want to see if there are any questions we can address, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, I don't see anything in the chat box yet. And, I think one of the points that I'll make with, just reinforce that the last speaker, Era, made was around, not necessarily steering away from every single possible example of biased material, but making sure that when stereotyped characters are used, for instance, that there's some sort of purpose to that, and being ready, if materials are adopted, being ready to provide some professional development to educators on how to frame the materials that are being presented, how to provide the context, so that we're not letting stereotyped characters sort of slip by without some examination, active examination in the classroom. And again, as Era mentioned in her comments, there may be a reason that an author uses a stereotype to make the point about stereotypes, for example. But I think it's that exploring the reasons, exploring the background, and making meaning, helping students make meaning of what a lot of them are already familiar with, which is seeing stereotypes reinforced about their own culture, about their own gender, about their own family structure, etc. So Barbara, I know you're trying to get the slideshow back up and running.
I am. We're getting there. Hang on.
And we may be able to.
I think we got it. And I think we can actually just jump ahead, Lori, to your section.
Okay, great. And that'll sidestep all of the recordings.
Yes.
Great. So in terms of family representation, it's important to look for depictions of families that represent the diversity of family structures and relationships that students experience. So, for instance, white heterosexual nuclear families are pretty typically portrayed in illustrations and other ways, but they're increasingly not the norm for families with school-aged children in our state. A variety of family configurations is critical to see in order for all students to feel seen and understood. And Barbara, if you could mute yourself, I think we're getting a little bit of background information from you, perhaps. As the slide indicates, materials should address many possibilities for loving relationships that don't necessarily rely on biological relationships or marriage. We also want to make sure we're avoiding stigmatizing students and families. So in addition to broadening representation, we want to make sure we're not stigmatizing or shaming a particular family structure or choices that students or families may have made. So a good example in my field with sexual health education is materials that focus so heavily on abstinence and avoidance of teen pregnancy that they stigmatize teen parents, whether those parents are in the classroom, which is the case in many high school classrooms and unfortunately a few middle school classrooms, or the parents of students in the classroom who may have started out themselves as teen parents. We want to also make sure that families, I think this has been covered in some of the other slides, but that families are represented that include a wide variety of ability levels. Again, this is a piece that I think we sometimes lose sight of the fact that people with cognitive or physical disabilities have families. They're parts of families, and we often don't see that particular group of students and their families represented in family depictions. All right, next slide, please. And in terms of teacher guidance for this section, review team members should be reviewing teacher materials, not just the instructional materials themselves. So this might include a teacher's manual as well as any teacher guidance. I've been looking at a few online curricula recently, and there's a heck of a lot of teacher-facing materials that need to be reviewed, as well as the lesson plans themselves. And sometimes one of the things I have found in some sexual health materials, for instance, is that if you look at one or the other, if you're only looking at the student-facing materials, you may see a very different tone in terms of bias than you would if you're looking at the teacher manual itself. And so be sure you're looking for both, because they are not all created equal. And I have seen, examples, unfortunately, of whether, one set of materials looks fine, but the other set of materials is really not inclusive at all. And then we're looking for guidance on how to approach, enhance, customize lessons for a specific student population. Hopefully, materials provide guidance on how to make connections between academic content and the local neighborhood, culture, environment, resources, including guidance on sources for valid non-traditional resources, such as oral histories. Family homework assignments are a way that can assist teachers with making connections between academic content and family or cultural values that aren't necessarily conversations in the classroom, but conversations in the family themselves. And then diverse student and family identities should be seen as assets and strengths that can advance individual and group learning rather than being seen as challenges or difficulties to be overcome. And I think that puts us back to you, Barbara. Barbara, you're still muted if you've been speaking. No, I think you're still muted.
There we go. Yes, I was still muted, and I was making some really eloquent comments that you guys will never have the opportunity to hear. Sorry, I had muted myself earlier and didn't unmute. So what we're going to be doing, actually, and Lori's going to guide us through this part, is having you take a look at the document itself. And after you take just a few minutes to kind of orient yourself to the document and the navigation, we're going to ask you to go to Jamboard to record some thoughts. So Lori, I'm going to kick it back to you, and you can kind of talk about some of those questions folks to be looking at. And I'll make sure the information's posted in the chat window. Great. And unfortunately, I am not, for some reason, I'm having a little trouble opening my Jamboard. So give me a second here. So my apologies. And, I can open it on my end, Lori, and I'll just share the screen. How about we do that?
Thank you. All right. So I'll let Barbara go ahead and open that before I start talking, because I know for me it's often helpful to be looking at the words at the same time I'm hearing the words. So we're going to be asking you to take a quick look at the instructional materials tool that we've given you, the review tool, and we're going to ask you to think about either a recent adoption of instructional materials or something that you have coming up. And what are the criteria in the document itself, in the tool, that would particularly resonate with your district or would be relevant for the particular types of materials? And so, for instance, when I'm looking at sexual health education content, I'm looking at different criteria than when than I might be for looking at other types of content. I think there's some additional really specific criteria that that are more relevant in our field, and in some communities that may be as well the case. And in your district, what other identifiers of students and families should be considered during the process? So we've identified quite a few in the tool, but there may be some that are not identified that are relevant for your district or community. What type of preparation would the review team members need in order to use the tool effectively? So again, you got some guidelines in an earlier slide on the types of preparation. But again, there may be really specific things based on what your particular needs are for a review at this time. And then any questions that come to mind about use of the tool, clarification needed, etc. And we have multiple pages in the Jamboard that will assist you with scrolling through some of those particular questions that we're asking you to think about. Anything further you'd wanted me to cover, Barbara?
No, I think that's good. I think just the clarification that you don't have to answer all those questions. We don't have enough time.
Yes, yes.
But it looks like some people are trying to get in and it's in view only. So let me take a quick look and make sure that anyone with the link can edit. All right, I have updated the permissions and let me know if, oh no.
People seem to be streaming into the Jamboard, so it looks like we should be good now. So again, we'll give you a couple of minutes. Just please review the tool, spend a couple of minutes taking a look at the sections that you think might be relevant, and then feel free when you're ready to start adding notes to the Jamboard on any or as many of the reflection questions as you'd like. We really want to make sure that you're thinking about this in ways that are relevant for your own experience, either again, a recent review that maybe could have been improved by use of this tool or something that you have coming up. Yeah, and I think that suggestion about engaging families in conversations through community cafes or other types of formats, just to get their perspective on what they're seeing and noticing in instructional materials that their students are bringing home.
So Lori, there's
I added a comment about the statewide instructional materials review we just did for sexual health education materials, and really the bias that we found in several different titles was pretty surprising to me, and spanned a wide variety of areas of wide variety of criteria and areas of bias. So I found it a super helpful tool, to be honest. We used a modified version or several relevant questions for our review. We didn't use the whole tool, but I found it very helpful, as did our review panel.
I see the comment, the French family unit just used nuclear families, and that was something that was definitely called out. Thank you for calling out foster care situations too. Actually, one of the recommendations that we had shortly after the first release of this tool was from an educator, I believe, in the Vancouver area, that really wanted us to, in that diversity wheel, include family structure as well, because that was something that, although we reference it in the document, wasn't really called out in that kind of visual representation. And so that was added there.
And I'll add, as the parent of an adopted child, I think when we fail to mention the fact that not all children come about, in the same way that we add people to our families in a variety of ways, and that there is a pretty complex set of relationships that are possible and healthy.
I think we'll leave this open for just one more minute as folks maybe can jot down their final thoughts. This Jamboard will remain open, so please feel free to revisit the document if you have any additional thoughts. Lori, was there any last information you wanted to add here before I stop the share on this particular document?
No, I'm just interested to see the additional comments being added around accessibility of materials, alt text, for folks who have different ability levels. I think that's, I'm not sure if that's something that we included in the bias tool. Barbara, was there anything that recognized the range of different types of learners?
Yeah, that's a good question. There really is not anything currently in there, mostly because that is a whole separate check for accessibility. But I think that's a good point, and we'll have to think about how that might be included in this as well, or at least reference other tools that will screen for ADA compliance. Okay, I am going to stop.
And can I just mention?
Oh, please.
Barbara, your sound is very garbled on my end. I'm not sure if anybody else is having the same problem, but
I was about to tell you the same thing, Lori. You're garbled on my end, and I don't know if that's coming from from me or you.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm not sure about the garbling sound.
Maybe it's on my end.
Ha! Nancy says I sound good, and it's on your end. I always liked you, Nancy. Yeah, so I'm not sure what's going on.
Yeah, it sounds like Barbara's good, and I'm the garbled person. So I'm going to stop talking and let you finish this out, Barbara.
I'll take us home here. So the last thing I wanted to mention briefly was just the let's see. Hang on just one moment. With just the fact that we would love your input on this tool. We'll certainly take your comments from the Jamboard, but also we have a tool feedback survey that is online now. And I just really want to point out the fact that this is version 1.0 of the adapted screening for biased content tool. And we fully expect that we're going to take all the feedback that we've been getting from these various different sessions, from districts that have implemented the tool this school year, and we'll be making adaptations to the resource. So if you would like your comments included, please take a moment and respond to that survey. And we'd love to hear from you, not only about the tool itself, but also about, what successful implementation strategies do you have? What ideas for professional learning and what it should look like? All of that information would be greatly appreciated. And I am going to close with just this contact information for us. Note that contact information for both Lori and myself is on that resource slide that we gave you a link to earlier. I am going to stop sharing this screen and I will jump back to the main view here. And in our last 4 minutes together, if there are any last questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat window. All right. Well, we will be here for a few more minutes if anyone would like to stick around and ask any last questions. But if none are appearing, we just want to say thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. It was a pleasure to virtually have you here. And I wish you all a wonderful summer and best of luck as the new school year begins.